The light was fading, the day's warmth slowly being replaced by the cool breath of evening. The fields stretched out, quiet except for the occasional rustle of wind through the grass. It was then that the faintest sound cut through the stillness. A soft whimper, barely audible as though it were a whisper carried on the breeze. It wasn't a cry of desperation, but of something more subtle, like the quiet plead of an animal still holding on. The man stopped, his steps slowing as he listened, straining to catch the sound again. The wind picked up, shifting the long grasses, but there it was. A soft whimper that seemed to come from nowhere, yet everywhere at once. It was a sound that suggested both weariness and hope. A faint cry from a creature who could no longer hide its pain. Following the noise, he moved carefully through the brush, each step measured as he scanned the ground before him. He had seen his share of wildlife, some injured, some frightened, but this was different. There was something about the way the sound carried, the quietness of it as though it came from something trying to remain unseen. It didn't take long before he found her, lying in the shade of a thicket. A small, emaciated dog, her body barely more than skin and bone. Her ribs showed through her thin coat, each breath shallow and labored. Her legs were stretched out, but her body remained tense, as if every movement took immense effort. The moment the man stepped closer, she lifted her head, eyes wide with caution. There was a flicker of uncertainty, but also something else. A quiet plea. She watched him with eyes that had seen too much, yet still held the softness of a creature willing to trust. Her fur was matted and unkempt, but her gaze was sharp, alert to every shift in the air. She didn't growl or back away. Instead, she stayed still, her body trembling, waiting for what came next. Her legs shook, barely able to support her, but she didn't move, didn't run. She was too tired, too weak. The man knelt, his hand steady, his voice low but soothing. "It's okay, girl," he whispered, though he knew she likely wouldn't understand the words. The tone, though, seemed to reassure her in a way that mere silence couldn't. Her ears flicked slightly in response, but she didn't retreat. She only watched him, her breath shallow as she remained still, her eyes never leaving his. There was an unspoken understanding between them, something quiet that passed in the space between his voice and her gaze. She had no strength to run, no strength to fight. What she had left, the man could feel, was a simple trust, not in him, but in the promise of relief, of help. She wasn't asking for it loudly. Her plea wasn't a desperate howl, but a soft, trembling presence that seemed to say, "Please, don't leave me here." For a long while, neither moved. The fading light around them deepened, the world growing softer. Slower, until the man finally reached out slowly, offering a hand. The dog didn't shy away, but instead, she inched closer, as though this small gesture might be her only hope. There was no sudden jump to affection, no quick recognition of safety. It was a tentative connection, one born of quiet understanding and gentle motion. Her breathing slowed as the minutes passed, her body still tense but no longer as frantic. There was no miracle in that moment, no instant recovery. But there was something in her eyes, in the way her body relaxed just a fraction, that told him he had done something right. He stayed with her a little longer, watching the light fade completely, knowing he couldn't help her all at once, but for now, he had done enough. For now, she wasn't alone. The man had stayed with her for hours, offering what little comfort he could, though he knew it wasn't enough. She was still weak, trembling, but the quiet trust she had shown was the only bond they shared. As dusk deepened into night, the dog had finally closed her eyes, resting in a quiet surrender, though her exhaustion was far from over. But in the early hours of the morning, just as the first light began to creep across the sky, the man heard a sound, soft and hesitant yet undeniably present. He stood, moving quietly to the door, and peered out into the yard. It was her again, the dog. She was standing in the same place as before, but this time, There was something different in her stance. She was carrying something. Her body swayed, and her movements were slow, each step measured with the effort of a creature who had nothing left to give, but still managed to move forward. He watched as she staggered towards him, her head low to the ground, a strange and tender burden held gently in her mouth. The sight was unmistakable. Tiny, blind puppies, not more than a few days old, clung to her, their fragile bodies curled tightly in her grasp. They were too small to walk, too weak to move on their own. One by one, she laid them at his feet, each pup carefully placed with an almost unnatural tenderness. Her own body trembled with the effort, but her eyes, once again, held that quiet plea. She had done what she could. She had carried them as far as her body would allow. Her ribs still showed through the thin coat of fur that clung to her skin, her frame fragile and spent. But in the way she moved, there was no sign of defeat. She had not abandoned them. She had brought them to him. Not food, not safety, but her most precious, fragile possession. There was a slow understanding in her actions, a message that needed no words. I can't care for them, but you can. The puppies, still blind and too young to even open their eyes, barely moved. They lay still for a moment, nestled in the dirt at his feet, vulnerable and silent. The dog lingered nearby, watching him closely, as if to make sure they would be safe, as if to ensure he would understand the weight of her sacrifice. Her breath came in shallow bursts, and though she was tired, she didn't retreat. She stayed, her eyes never leaving him. The man bent down slowly, careful not to startle her. His hands hovered over the puppies, but he didn't touch them immediately. He wanted to give her the space she needed to observe, to process, before any intervention. The mother's eyes remained fixed on her pups, a quiet, unspoken command in the way she watched him. It wasn't fear that he saw in her gaze. It was something more fragile, a small, still hope, an offering that had no words but was filled with meaning, the promise of her willingness to trust. He gently gathered the puppies one by one, cradling them in his hands. As he lifted them, the mother didn't flinch. She watched with patience, with a quiet relief, as if her duty had been fulfilled. When all were safely in his care, she took a few hesitant steps back, still watching, but now there was a softness in her eyes, a quiet surrender. The job was no longer hers. She had done what she could, and now it was time to rest. The man carried the puppies inside, laying them on a soft bed of cloth, and the dog, though still weak, lay down nearby. Her body shook, not from fear, but from the deep exhaustion that had consumed her. Her head rested on her paws as she watched him, her eyes closing slowly, her body finally giving in to the need for rest. She had carried the burden long enough, and now, in this quiet moment, she could allow herself the peace of knowing that the little lives she had fought so hard to protect were safe. Outside, the wind had picked up again, and the soft rustle of the grass was the only sound that filled the air. The dog's breathing was slow now, her body still, her puppies safe and secure. For the first time in what seemed like an eternity, she allowed herself to rest, her trust in the man unspoken but clear. And as the morning light continued to grow, the scene remained calm, the world outside untouched. The burden had been passed, and for now, all was still. The man returned to the small shed the next morning, a sense of urgency weighing on his chest. The dog had not moved much, her body still stretched out beside her puppies. She had allowed herself a brief moment of rest, but hunger and fatigue were etched in every movement. Her eyes, soft but watchful, followed his every step as he approached, and there was a tension in her posture that had not been there the night before. She had protected them all, but her body was frail, her spirit worn thin. The man crouched beside her, careful not to startle her or the pups. His hand, though steady, hovered for a moment over the ground as he gathered a few scraps, softening them with water. He could feel her eyes on him, assessing his actions. There was no sudden trust, no eager leap for food. She watched, still cautious but no longer withdrawn. Her body remained tense, but the softest movement from her tail stirred the air, a signal of something small, something fragile. He placed the softened scraps in front of her, each piece as gentle and non-threatening as he could make it. She hesitated, sniffing the food at first, her nose twitching in curiosity. The slow, deliberate way she approached the food told him everything he needed to know. She wasn't starving for the sake of hunger alone. She was starving for the safety of her pups, the quiet assurance that her protectiveness would not be compromised. Her instinct to guard was strong, and the food could not be consumed until she felt the fragile balance of trust between them. Her tail, barely lifting from the ground, twitched again, a hesitant acknowledgement. It wasn't the wild wag of an animal completely at ease, but it was something, a tentative sign that she recognized his care. With a low, almost imperceptible sound, she inched closer to the scraps, her movements slow and deliberate. The man's eyes remained on her, his presence calm, offering only what she needed. She ate, but it was measured, slow, as if each bite required a moment of pause, as if she had to remind herself that this was safe, that her pups were still close, and that he meant no harm. She barely glanced away from the pups, her gaze always returning to them, but she ate. There was no rush now. For the first time since he had met her, she allowed herself to take something for herself. Her head lowered slowly, her eyes closed briefly as she took a few more bites, her body stiff with exhaustion, but also with a growing sense of relief. The food wasn't a cure, but it was a small comfort, and for her, it was enough. The man remained seated nearby, offering nothing more than his quiet presence. He didn't need to speak. The silence between them was soft, not awkward, but filled with something unspoken. There was no hurry, no demand, only the patient respect of two beings who had not yet fully understood one another, but were learning to share space, to share time. As she ate, he noticed her tail shift again, this time with a slight but noticeable rise. It was a tentative gesture, almost imperceptible, but it spoke volumes. She had not yet fully trusted him, but she had recognized the kindness in his actions. And with that recognition, there was the smallest shift in her. Her body was still weak, her guard never fully down, but there was a moment of peace in her actions. For the first time, she let go of her rigid stance just a little. She had learned something. She had learned that the world was not just a place of threat and danger. After a few more moments, the mother shifted her weight, her body still trembling with the weight of everything she had carried. But now, there was the faintest glimmer of something new in her eyes. She looked up, met his gaze for a brief second, and then returned to her pups. Her movements were slow and deliberate, but not out of fear. There was no tension now, only the soft, steady rhythm of an animal who had chosen to eat, chosen to trust. The bond between them had not been sealed, but it had been acknowledged. The puppies, still blind and fragile, squirmed beside her. She stayed close, their little bodies nestling against hers for warmth and safety, while she, too, began to feel a small sense of comfort. The man quietly withdrew, leaving her to finish, but the weight of the moment lingered between them. She would never fully relinquish her watchful nature, but there was something more to her now than just survival. There was a quiet, growing hope, and for the first time, her tail was lifted just enough to show a sign of trust. The rain began to fall slowly. At first, just a few drops scattered across the dry earth, but it soon turned into a steady rhythm that beat softly against the ground. The weather had shifted so suddenly, it felt almost like a warning. The sky, once clear and vast, now hung heavy with dark clouds, casting a shadow over the landscape. The man stood at the edge of the yard, watching the small dog and her pups. He could see the discomfort in her every movement, the way she shivered beneath the thin covering of her fur, and he knew he couldn't let her remain out in this. Her body was exhausted, worn down by hunger, fear, and the unrelenting need to protect her pups. The moment she had laid them down in front of him, her protective instincts had remained, but so had her caution. She didn't trust him entirely, not yet. He could see it in the way she watched him, her eyes constantly flickering between the safety of the shed and the threat she felt in the air. She was torn between the need for warmth, shelter, and the instinct to guard her tiny family. He could see the tension in her body, the way her legs were half raised, ready to stand if needed, yet not moving, not yet willing to make the leap. The rain grew heavier, and he could see the thin tremor of the dog's body as she tried to shield her pups from the wetness. She shifted them under her, nudging them gently with her nose, instinctively trying to protect them from the storm. The man stepped forward carefully, his movements slow and deliberate, a silent promise that he wouldn't force anything. His hand reached out, palm open and inviting, and he stopped just a few feet from her, unsure whether she would allow him any closer. The dog didn't flinch, but she didn't move either. Her body stiffened slightly as his hand hovered in the air, and for a moment she seemed to question whether she should stay where she was or seek refuge elsewhere. Her gaze didn't leave him, not for a second. Her eyes were wary, filled with the raw, fearful instinct of an animal that had known nothing but the need to protect. Yet in those eyes there was something else. Something deeper, something softer. It was the subtle flicker of recognition that perhaps this man wouldn't hurt her or her pups. He stepped closer, just a few inches, his hand still outstretched. She remained perfectly still, her body tense, yet she didn't pull back. He reached the edge of the shed's doorway, moving cautiously as if the very air might shift, making her run in fear. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of wet earth and grass, the cold seeping into the small shed where the man stood. The dog's body quivered as the first drops of rain reached her fur, and she took a step backward, instinctively moving towards the shelter. She paused, eyes locked on him, waiting to see what he would do next. In a soft, measured motion, the man knelt down, careful not to startle her further. His voice, when it came, was nothing more than a soft murmur. "It's okay, girl," he said, though he knew she wouldn't understand the words. But the tone, the quiet calm, seemed to reach her in some way, for she lowered her head slightly, a sign of both wariness and the acceptance of his presence. She took another step into the shed, moving cautiously, keeping her pups close to her chest. She curled into a tight ball, her back to the man, yet her head still turned just enough to keep him in her peripheral vision. Her body was rigid, her muscles tense from both exhaustion and the weight of the burden she carried. But as the rain continued to fall outside, the shelter of the shed seemed to provide her a moment of relief. The cold was no longer biting at her bones, and the fear that had kept her standing outside now began to fade. She was still alert, still on edge, but there was a subtle shift in her behavior. The man waited for her to settle. He didn't rush to comfort her, didn't force his way into her space. He understood that trust could not be earned in a single moment, and that any gesture of kindness needed to come at her own pace. As he remained still, watching her, the smallest of sounds from the pups caught his attention. They shifted, their tiny bodies squirming in the warmth of their mother's fur. Their eyes were still closed, their bodies weak and vulnerable. Yet they clung to their mother's warmth and presence. She was their protector, and in this moment, she was all they knew. The man stayed on his knees, his hands resting gently on the ground, his posture open but unthreatening. He didn't try to push further, but the distance between them, although still there, felt smaller. It was an invisible bridge, one built on quiet gestures and time, one that neither of them could rush. He watched her body relax just slightly, her muscles softening as she allowed herself to feel the safety of the shed, the warmth of the small family she had fought so hard to protect. For a long while, neither moved. The rain fell steadily against the roof, the air inside the shed heavy with the smell of wet earth. The heat of bodies huddled together, and the silent presence of one man and one dog, each in their own way trying to come to terms with the shared space between them. She would occasionally glance up, her eyes locking with his, as though assessing whether this was truly a safe place, whether this man could be trusted. He didn't move, not at first. He didn't try to coax her further into trust, didn't reach out for her or the pups. The quiet between them was thick with unspoken understanding, and he simply let the moment sit between them. Time, in these moments, felt slower, stretched thin. Outside, the rain continued to pour, but inside the shed, there was stillness, a soft calm that seemed to settle over them like a blanket. Eventually, after what felt like an eternity, the dog shifted slightly, moving her body just enough to allow the smallest of space between her and her pups. She curled her tail around them, but her body, while still alert, wasn't as tense. There was a subtle, almost imperceptible relaxation in her posture. She didn't yet fully trust, but she had allowed herself to rest, to accept that she was safe, at least for now. And that, to the man, was enough. The night deepened, and the storm raged on outside. But inside the shed, there was something quieter, something tender in the way the dog rested, the way the pups huddled closer to her warmth. The fragile trust between them had been allowed to take root, a trust that would grow slowly, over time, in small moments of calm like this one. For now, it was enough to know that they were all safe, that the storm outside had no hold on them in this shared space. And as the wind howled in the distance, the man allowed himself to leave them be, the smallest gesture of respect for the trust that had been, however briefly, given. The night passed slowly, quietly, until the storm finally began to ease, leaving behind a world washed clean. Inside the shed, the man slept soundly, knowing that in the quiet corners of the night a small family had found peace. Fragile and tentative, but real. The days passed slowly, the storm now only a memory, the world washed clean by the rain. Inside the shed, the man continued his quiet watch over the small family. The dog's condition had improved, though she remained fragile. Her ribs were no longer as pronounced, her movements less shaky, though she still moved with the cautious awareness of an animal who had learned to protect. She no longer trembled with hunger, her eyes were clearer, her coat began to shine, and there was a softness to her expression that had been absent when they first met. Her pups, too, had begun to change. The tiny, blind creatures who once lay helplessly against her now wriggled and squirmed in their little pile, their bodies slowly gaining strength. They no longer remained still. Each day brought a new shift in their energy, a new sense of curiosity. Their tiny paws, still uncoordinated, reached for whatever was close, whether it was the warmth of their mother or a stray bit of cloth that had fallen near them. They were not yet strong enough to stand, but their movements were more intentional, their bodies beginning to stretch out, to move as if they were testing the limits of the world around them. The man kept his distance, observing them with a calm respect, but his presence was no longer met with the same suspicion that had once dominated the dog's gaze. Her eyes, though still watchful, had softened, and the tightness in her body was slowly loosening. The trust between them, though fragile, had grown with each passing day. She no longer stiffened when he approached. She no longer flinched when he offered her food or when he reached for the pups. There was an unspoken agreement between them now. She would protect her young, and he would respect her space, offering only what was needed, never more. As the pups began to explore their small world, their movements grew more confident, their tiny bodies tumbling over each other in the grass. At first, their steps were wobbly, unsure, and each clumsy fall was met with a soft whimper, but their mother, despite the exhaustion still lingering in her bones, watched over them carefully. Her gaze never strayed far from her pups, but there was something in her demeanor now, something more open. She no longer hovered anxiously over every moment. Instead, she observed, allowing them to grow, to make their own small discoveries. One of the pups, a little darker than the others, stumbled away from the group, its tiny paws scrabbling against the earth. It let out a soft cry, uncertain of its own steps. Immediately the mother's head lifted, her body stiffening for a moment. But then, with a gentleness that only a mother could know, she lowered her head and nudged the pup back towards the group. The pup grumbled softly, but its eyes, still unseeing, blinked and rolled toward her warmth. She didn't reprimand or scold, but simply guided it with her nose, a quiet reminder of her role. She was their protector, their guide, and though her strength was still returning, her instinct was as sharp as ever. The man watched this quietly, his heart heavy with the slow unfolding of their story. The change in the dog was profound. She had been a figure of tension, distrust, and survival when they first met. Now, she was an animal slowly reawakening to the peace she had once known, the safety that could be hers again. But the man understood. It wasn't complete. Trust wasn't an easy thing to give, not after everything she had endured. It would take more than food, more than shelter, to heal the scars of her past. It would take time, patience, and the understanding that she could never fully surrender her watchfulness, her instinct to protect, to be cautious. Yet there were moments, small moments, that spoke of the change. One afternoon, after the pups had eaten and fallen into a light sleep, the dog rested. She lay with her head nestled against the man's knee, her body pressed close to his, but not too close. Her eyes were half closed, her body relaxed in a way that seemed foreign to her. There was a quiet stillness between them. She had chosen this moment, chosen to let him be near, not out of necessity but because she felt safe. The man, for the first time, allowed himself to rest too. His hand gently moved over her fur, slow and steady. She didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. The soft touch was met with a soft exhale, a quiet surrender. It was in that moment, a moment of simple tenderness, that the man understood the quiet power of trust. It wasn't in grand gestures, but in small, deliberate acts of patience. The dog had been through so much: fear, hunger, the harsh reality of a world that had given her nothing but struggle. And yet here she was, curling close to a human, allowing him into her world. It wasn't a complete surrender, not yet, but it was something more than what it had been. Days turned into weeks, and the puppies grew stronger, their tiny bodies filled out, their eyes beginning to open, blurry at first, but gradually focusing on the world around them. The mother remained by their side, her body still close but no longer hovering with the same tension. She had learned in her own quiet way that her pups were safe now. They were safe in the world the man had provided, safe in the space he had given them. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. The man didn't try to intervene too much. He simply watched, offering food, checking their condition, and waiting for the moment when they would be ready to leave the safety of the shed. The puppies were learning to walk now, their legs stronger, their steps more sure. They tumbled over each other, their tiny bodies full of energy and curiosity. And when they moved outside for the first time, the mother followed, her eyes alert, her body tense with the need to protect them. But there was no longer the frantic urgency there had once been. She was watching, but she was no longer alone in this. One evening, as the sky turned pink with the fading light, the man stood in the doorway of the shed, watching them all. The mother, her pups, and the world they had slowly begun to trust again. The air was calm now, the storm gone, and the landscape lay before them, still and quiet. The dog, no longer trembling, walked a few steps away from her pups and paused, her eyes on the man. There was no sudden rush, no frantic bark, just a quiet acknowledgement, a shared moment of understanding. She looked at him for a long time, her eyes soft, her body relaxed, and for the first time, the man realized that she wasn't just a creature that needed help. She was a creature that had found a small piece of peace in a world that had been unkind. The pups followed her, stumbling over the grass, their tiny paws sinking into the soft earth as they explored. The man stepped back, allowing them their space, allowing the moment to be theirs. He didn't need to do anything more. The journey they had been on together had been long and quiet, but it had reached this point, a quiet return of life. And as he watched them move through the grass, their tiny bodies moving as one, he felt a deep, quiet satisfaction. The mother, finally able to rest, finally able to trust, lowered her head to the ground, her eyes on her pups, her body still and calm. The puppies, now full of energy, ran around her, their small bodies tumbling in the grass, and as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft golden light over the world, the man stepped back into the shed, leaving them to their peace. The quiet return of life was not dramatic. It was not loud or abrupt. It was simple, and in its simplicity, it was beautiful. The man could hear the soft sound of the pups' whimpers as they continued to explore the world, and the gentle rustle of the grass as the wind picked up. And in that moment, he knew he had given them more than just shelter. He had given them a chance, and as the night settled around them, it was clear. They had all found something they had been searching for, a quiet, tender peace.